Great. So this is the book. And as I said, I had the opportunity last year to write this with Anjali through Zoom, which was really kind of amazing. We wanted to focus in this book not just on the really terrible things that happened to Anjali. She was trafficked at the age of 11 from her village in Nepal to the brothels of Calcutta, and obviously suffered horrible things in that experience. But we really, through this book, she didn't really want to focus or re-traumatize herself by rehashing a lot of what happened there. So what we did was, for that section of the book, I used some journals that she kept at that time, right after she was rescued. And we also interviewed a lot of the people that were involved at that time, like the people who were involved in rescuing her, the counselors that she worked with immediately after rescue, the shelter home where she lived in Calcutta and where I met her, the shelter home that she then went to when she was repatriated back to Nepal. So we were able to kind of piece together that period of time through interviewing all those people. And I interviewed her many, many times. And we focused in our talk on the root causes of trafficking. What happened before she was trafficked? Why did this happen? What were the vulnerabilities in her life that made it possible for her to be sold to India at the age of 11? What was going on in her family and community? And then we also focused a lot on the healing process, which she really wanted to talk about a lot, which was kind of after being rescued, the steps that happened to be able to enable her to rebuild her life. And what's really special about Anjali, here's a picture of her. You can see her here. She's the one holding the baby, and that's her two younger sisters in the picture there with her. And then you can see her with me and the baby in the school. So I met Anjali just a couple of weeks after she was rescued. And this was in Calcutta at a shelter home where my organization was working at that time. And the way we met was itself kind of amazing. We had come to the shelter home that day, and when we got there, the person who ran the shelter home said, I really want you to work with this newly rescued group of girls today, because they definitely could use some extra support. They haven't really been interacting with the rest of the girls at the shelter. And partly it's because they're so newly rescued. They had a lot of trauma. They were very young. They ranged from 10 to 15 years of age. The oldest was 15. Anjali was 13 or 14 at that time. And they also weren't really interacting very much with the other girls because they spoke a different language. And they didn't speak Nepali. They're from Nepal. This shelter was in India. They spoke a tribal language called Tamang. And no one who was on the staff of the shelter home spoke that language. And so there was a translator coming a couple times a week to work with them, but it was a very difficult time. And they were feeling, kind of isolated. And as luck would have it, that day we had brought with us to the shelter a friend of one of our staff members who was Tamang. And we didn't know the girls were going to be Tamang. And to be honest, I didn't even really know what Tamang was at that time. And so we brought this woman, Rangita. And when we went to approach the circle of girls, there were 19 of them who'd been involved in this one rescue. 19 girls, and Anjali was one of them. And as we drew closer towards them, there was maybe, 2 or 3 of us, all women. They kind of closed their circle, like they kind of, shrunk into themselves. And, they seemed very, very fearful, which is, of course, very normal. And then Rangita spoke in Tamang, and it was like just the sun rose in their faces. They just turned towards her with such surprise and joy and relief, to hear an adult speaking their language for one of the first times in several years. So that was an amazing moment, and it gave us kind of an in to be able to build a relationship with these girls. And at that time, I was working at that shelter home for about 2 weeks, and we were painting a mural and doing some other therapeutic arts projects. And Anjali was just, my right-hand woman the whole time. She's just such an amazing kid, so kind and so smart. And, she was already picking up some English. And so we were able to communicate. And when it came time to leave, she gave me a card that she made of leaves that she found around the shelter home. And the card told her story, which we talked about a little bit, during the 2 weeks, but the card really told the story in a deeper way that I hadn't understood. And it explained that when she was 7, her father passed away, and his death was one of the reasons that made her vulnerable to being getting trafficked. Her mother became very depressed and had mental illness, and that, became another vulnerability for her. But she had been trafficked and she had been rescued, and she had developed this dream at that, even just weeks after being rescued out of a brothel. 13 or 14 years old, she had identified her dream. And her dream was to go back to her village and reopen the school, because the school had closed. Her father was the school's caretaker, and when he died, it closed, and she left school second grade, and that was part of why she got trafficked as well. That's another vulnerability, not having education. So her dream was to go back to the village and reopen the school and share information and awareness and her own story to change the mindset of the community. The community where Anjali lives, it's an area called Nuwakot, and it is very infamous in the anti-trafficking world because it has such a high rate of trafficking and child marriage, to the point where 80% of girls in the community are either trafficked, as Anjali was, or forced into a child marriage, as one of her sisters was at the age of 12. And it has become so normalized and so accepted in the community. And that was what she really wanted to change with this dream. But of course, at the time, the dream seemed very, very far off and impossible. And later in this talk, I'm going to share with you, what happened that enabled her to get from that point of being a 14-year-old survivor to the principal and founder of this school, which opened in October. And that's a lot of what the book is about as well, but I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. Before I do that, I just want to share with you a little bit about human trafficking in South Asia. I've been working in this field for the last 18 years. And before I got involved in this, I was a songwriter for film and television. And I had a completely different kind of life. My children were very small. And I had a song that was in the Tribeca Film Festival. I went down to New York City to see it. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to see a film called The Day My God Died, which was a wonderful documentary, still available online, you should check it out, about the trafficking of young girls from Nepal to India. Unlike you courageous people, I was very hesitant to go see this film, and actually had decided not to go see it because I felt like it was an overwhelming issue and I wouldn't be able to do anything about it. And I was afraid of it, honestly. I was afraid of the heartbreak of looking at something so terribly difficult and dark. But I did end up going because it was the only movie available in my time frame, and I had a free ticket, and like, I'm a New Englander and we don't waste. So I went ahead and saw this movie, and it changed my life. It truly changed my life in an instant, or I guess in 90 minutes, because it highlighted all the things that people around the world were doing to fight human trafficking, including survivors. It showed survivors who were working at the border, stopping every car, looking for suspicious situations and stopping trafficking in progress. And it profiled girls like Anita, who would go back to the brothels where then they themselves were enslaved, and bringing police and rescue organizations to do raids and rescue others. And so looking at them and what they'd experienced and what they were doing, I knew that I, a songwriter from Cape Cod with 2 little kids, could find a way to help. And I was very, very determined to do so. And first, I had a lot to learn. I had to really dig into and find out about this very difficult issue. The kind of slavery that Anjali was trafficked into was brothel slavery. She was taken to one of the 5 red light areas in Calcutta, and she was forced to have sex with 10 or 15 men every single night. It was a brutal, horrific experience. And it is an experience that is still very much going on. There was some improvement in the trafficking situation from Nepal, but then there was a series of earthquakes, and then there was COVID. And so unfortunately, the situation is still very, very severe. And there's probably, the UN estimates 15 to 20 girls, Nepali girls, every single day who are trafficked over to India, and most of them never return. But as you probably know, sex trafficking is not the only type of slavery, and it certainly is not the only issue that's affecting Anjali's village and villages like it. The other big issue there is child marriage. For Anjali, there were these boys from a neighboring village, and they would just come every single day and try to catch her and force her into a child marriage. And they would do that. They would just try to catch the young girls. As soon as a girl was 10 or 11, they would come after her. And it's still very much the case. And there was a lot of pressure from families as well, because families are very desperately poor in this region, and there's this normalization. So it comes to an age when girls are 11 or 12 where there's a lot of pressure to either contribute to the family through sex work, going to India, or going into a child marriage, which is what Anjali's sister ended up doing. Although she is now, with Anjali's help, getting out of that situation. Those two issues are incredibly linked together. They're not separate from each other at all. A lot of times a girl will be put into a child marriage or choose to go into a marriage at a very young age, and then she and her husband will move to another city, and far away from her support systems, will be very vulnerable and will be trafficked by a neighbor or a landlord or a relative. And in other cases, it's very common in Anjali's village, men will come to the village, marry a girl, take her back to India, sell her, and then go to another village and repeat that again and again and again with like hundreds and hundreds of girls. So the two issues are very, very linked, because once you're put into a child marriage, you're not getting an education, and that itself, creates a huge vulnerability. Girls are also, and boys are, trafficked for forced begging and for domestic labor. And again, every type of slavery has an element of sexual violence and sexual risk for kids. So in our organization, we don't, really discriminate about what has happened to a person, because we know that, when has rape not been a part of slavery? It always is. And when a child is removed from their home in an unsafe environment, they're incredibly vulnerable to sexual violence. And so very often, ends up just kind of being amorphous and weaving in together. Slavery is very much intergenerational. And I talked about that, in relation to Anjali's village, but it's very much true everywhere. There are communities like hers where it's become very normalized to traffic mothers and daughters. And literally, if you walk through the village streets with Anjali, just point to every house. So they have 2 daughters in India, that's sisters in India. My aunt lives there, she's in India, the mother and the daughter in India. And it's every single home in the village is touched by human trafficking. What happens when a person returns without any proper services, even if they are able to return, which a small percentage do, but they don't have any way of dealing with their trauma or getting any help for themselves. So then their children are very vulnerable, and the situation just keeps repeating. There are also some tribal groups and cultures within India where trafficking has become the main industry of the entire community. And so it just repeats generation after generation. Our organization does a lot of work in the red light area, and there we're working with women who, like Anjali, were trafficked at a young age in their early teens and are now adults in their 30s or even 40s, and they have children. And because they share one room in the brothel with their children, the children are extremely vulnerable to assault, and most of them have been assaulted, but they're also almost certainly going to be trafficked themselves if there is not an intervention, because they're not getting a proper education and they're just seeing this way of life and are not exposed to any other way of life. So the key there is to get in there and offer alternatives to children and mothers and a safe place to be, and present that there is another way of life. But without that kind of intervention, like this family that you see here in the picture, who these people were all enslaved. They have now been freed, but they were all enslaved for like 50 years. So the grandmother was, and there's another generation that's not pictured there, through bonded labor, which is like debt slavery. So how do girls get trafficked? What makes them vulnerable? Well, I'll tell you what it's not. It's not the movie Taken, and it's not being kidnapped or snatched off the street. I have met thousands of survivors at this point, and even all the girls that I've talked to and heard their story, no one was kidnapped off the street. No one was taken by strangers. There was always a relative, a neighbor, a family member, a landlady, a sister, a mother who was involved in trafficking them, or they went in search of work not knowing what would happen to them when they got there. And then once they were in that big city, cut off from their support systems, they were trafficked. So what makes people vulnerable? Death of a parent, mental illness in the family, war, civil unrest, natural disasters like earthquakes, public health crises like COVID, and poverty. You know, it certainly can happen to anyone, but in South Asia, 99.9% of the time, the people that are trafficked are poor. And they may have been seen by their family as worthless. There may have been pressure, you know, for dowry, for a variety of reasons. This person became extremely vulnerable. And in Anjali's case, as I said, there were several vulnerabilities. Her father died, the school closed, her mother had mental illness, and there was this incredible poverty in the family. A younger sister was born, she had a sickness, and so there was this incredible pressure on her to earn and help and contribute to the family. She had no idea what it was, because they didn't talk about, you know, about it, but she just knew you went to India to work. So she said, okay. And some uncles took her to India. And it wasn't until she got there that she even really found out what sex was. Just had absolutely no idea. So there's also a vulnerability of a complete lack of awareness and understanding of what the situation was. So now for some good news. I know that was a lot. It can be heavy. How do people get out and stay out of slavery? Anjali is just one of several thousand, I guess about 5,000 girls at this point that we've been able to walk alongside on their journey to freedom and independence. And our organization's work is with survivors like Anjali, but it's also very, very much about prevention, about working in red light areas, border villages, rescue shelters with girls who have not yet been trafficked, but who are at extreme risk, and putting the pieces in place to make sure that they never have to endure the horror of trafficking. And we also do a lot of work with survivors, helping them rebuild their lives, rebuild their identities, and addressing some of those root causes to make sure that this doesn't repeat in their children and on into the next generations. We have a formula for helping girls, which is shelter, education, employment, and mental health. And we find that if we address those 4 issues and, you know, put the right pieces in place, by far the large majority of women and girls are able to build a strong life, live independently, heal from their trauma, move out of shelter homes, and really having kind of amazing and gorgeous lives. Anjali is a superstar. She's, you know, started this project to fight trafficking in her village, and we have others like Saba, who's going to be the first gynecologist in her area, the first woman gynecologist in her Muslim community, and some other real stars. But a lot of girls and women maybe just go on to have a simpler life, and they might get married and have children, or they have a job, a simpler job, but they are able to heal from this incredible trauma and find incredible joy. So the first piece of it is making sure they have a safe place to live. This is a shelter that we built in North India, and we have several others that we've built or expanded. And as I said, we do a lot of shelter work right in the red light area, where we give kids a safe place to be while their mothers are seeing clients. So it's not overnight shelter, but it's open until midnight and very early in the morning, which allows the kids to be safe and not be in the same room as their mom when their mom is seeing clients. Education is the most important thing that we do. I feel like without it, if you can't read a contract, you're going to be able to be tricked, and you're never going to be completely safe. And if you stay in school through 10th or 11th grade, you've kind of aged out of the most vulnerable point, and hopefully have the wherewithal, the skills, the awareness, the information to be able to keep yourself safe. A lot of girls like Anjali, when they're trafficked, they're not necessarily kept locked up, but they don't try to run away because they're in this place where they don't speak the language, they don't know what's going on. They may think that their parents or relatives, you know, want them to be there or paid some money and that they have to repay it. So a lot of it really is about understanding the laws and knowing how to protect yourself, because there are resources, there's helplines, and, you know, there are options for people. If they have a good education, it's very much less likely for them to be trafficked. So we do a tremendous amount of education work. And there's Anjali. very soon, I guess 2015. So about 6 years ago now, and she was 19. This was not too long after she came back to Nepal. I think she was 17 when she was repatriated back to Nepal, and she'd already been getting education at the shelter home. But when she got back to Nepal for the first time, she got to go to a real school, and she had to start kind of at the beginning, you know, second or third grade education. And a lot of girls have a hard time with that. You know, they're full grown 17-year-old going into a younger classroom, but she did it and pulled herself through and is about to get her bachelor's degree in education. And there behind her is the school. It's not painted yet, but it's mostly constructed. Anjali went back to the village in January of 2021 with her husband and her young son. You can see him there. And we have been fundraising all year long, like fiends, and like almost dollar by dollar, like we'd raise it and then we'd spend it, and then we'd raise it and then we'd spend it to get this thing built. And it's very well on its way. This needs to be painted, but the school opened in October. We're currently educating 55 kids. And already I've been to the village, you know, 3 times now, already seeing the changes in the community and the attitudes. When Anjali first went back there, to be honest, I was scared for her because the people that trafficked her are powerful people in the government there. And they were very much aware of her and had made some threats against her and her family. But the longer she's there, the school is open, you know, the community and neighbors and parents are starting to knit around her and, you know, create a safety net of support around her. So it really feels different. It feels less dangerous for her and more supported. And it feels like things are shifting a little bit already with the parents who've, you know, chosen to send their kids to that school and who are allowing older girls like this girl who's pictured here with Anjali. Her name is Maya, and she's, you know, 19, again, had left school at a very young age and is getting the remedial education to be able to rejoin school and, you know, have a completely different kind of life than she would otherwise have been able to have. We're also involved in vocational training and employment, and we have beautiful jewelry made by some of our survivors. Increasingly, in the last 2 years, we've really been also focusing on computer training and spoken English because girls have those skills. They can get many different kinds of jobs. And with COVID and everything, it's really kind of been a great opportunity to refocus a little bit around that and put in a lot more of that kind of vocational training. Survivors are very stigmatized, as you can imagine, in a lot of places. They're blamed for what's done to them. Families won't accept them back. Often they can't really ever go home and they need to stay in shelters until they reach adulthood. But earning a good living really, really changes the equation on that. And girls are able to take a leadership role in their families and their communities. And several of the girls pictured here have rescued others in their families and villages and have prevented other girls in their families and communities from being trafficked because they were empowered by being, you know, a high wage earner and by everything that they learned together in this program. So we're very proud of that kind of activism as well. And mental health, something we talk about a lot in the book. Anjali talks a lot about integrating the trauma. You can't undo what has happened. You know, this terrible, really unspeakable things have happened. And she believes, and I agree, that you don't have to go on Oprah about it, but you do need to find a way to share it with at least one other person and acknowledge that it's happened to you and, you know, find some kind of words to be able to work through it. When they were first rescued, as I said, the girls were very young. They were very innocent, you know, village girls, and they didn't even really have the words to talk about what happened, you know, in their language or in any language. So the counselors were so skillful and so sensitive in finding ways, you know, for them non-verbally to be able to express, you know, what had happened and integrate the trauma, you know, and find a way to move forward. Everyone's journey is very different. For Anjali, forgiveness has been a really, really big part of it. She has made the choice to forgive everyone that was involved because she feels that to not do so will poison her life and make it impossible to move forward. So that's kind of a big theme in the book as well. I don't know how she does it. I haven't forgiven those people. I see them in the village and I get mad and want to be Rambo and kill them. It's really, quite hard. But for her, I think because she does deeply understand, because they're also her relatives or, community members, that she knows that this isn't any one person's fault. This is a system that's been in place for decades, and it's poisoned everyone, boys and girls, men and women, and you can't blame one person. If you hold on to that rage and bitterness, will break you and make it impossible to move forward. Rediscovering self is also a big part of the therapeutic process. And I've seen this a lot in lots of survivor groups, that people haven't ever had any choice about anything. Even, obviously when you're trafficked, you have a choice about anything: what you eat, what you wear, when you sleep, if you sleep, and who you have sex with. But even before they were trafficked, they didn't have choices, because they come from areas where women and girls don't have choices. And so it's very hard for them to identify their preferences, even on the most simple thing, like, hey, do you guys want to play soccer or do you want to draw? And they couldn't answer that question, let alone a more difficult question, like, would you like to pursue education, or would you like to do some vocational training? Or, do you just need some time to heal and work on your mental health? They can answer those questions because they've never had the opportunity to think about who they were as a person and what choices what preferences they might have. So the therapists and counselors that worked with Anjali, and our team as well, has come up with different ways of working through that. Games that allow you to access your feelings, like you close your eyes and put something on your tongue, like, it's something sour, and you're involuntarily will make a face like, and that is kind of like, it's an emotion. I mean, it's expressed through your face and through your body, but it's like a starting point. And then you put something sweet on your tongue and you notice that bitter, nasty taste goes away. And so it's just kind of like a game, a way of kind of helping you access how you're feeling and what you're experiencing. Another one that we do is like a pillow fight. You take a pillow and you ask a question like, what's your favorite color? And you throw it at someone, and then you yell your favorite color, and then they have to throw it at someone else and yell their favorite color, and everyone starts laughing, and it's really, really fun. But something as simple as saying your favorite color or your favorite food is surprisingly difficult for girls that have had this particular experience. So these are some of the games and tools that enabled Anjali and many others to kind of work through some of that trauma. Okay, I have talked a lot, and now I would like to take some questions and think about this together and talk about this through together. And so I'm going to stop sharing, and